Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 242, The Coull Family Tragedy. Just a warning, there is graphic information contained in this episode. In the early hours of the 3rd of November 1913, Mrs. Kate Fox was savagely attacked in her home on the farm, Osborne Farm, near Berrigan, New South Wales. Her brother Alexander and niece Hilda were also set upon. The Coull siblings were the children of John Coull and Isabella Brown. John and Isabella were Scottish and married in Greens, Eden Killy, Morayshire, Scotland, on the 3rd of February 1860. John was a ploughman in Scotland and continued this occupation when they emigrated to Tasmania. They had 10 children, the first 2 being born before they emigrated to Tasmania, leaving Glasgow on the Lady Agidia. On the 11th of January 1862, from Glasgow as bounty immigrants, costing them £40, they arrived in Launceston on the 19th of April 1862. The remaining children were born in Table Cape, Port Sorell and Longford. 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Isabella, died of TB, consumption, in Westbury, Tasmania in 1878, when Elizabeth was 15 and Isabella 9. On the 5th of May 1880, in the Launceston Examiner, at the police court today, 2 cases were heard, the first under the School Act for not sending children to school. The first, John Coull, was adjourned for a fortnight as he was not to be found. His wife was present but stated he'd been away for 9 weeks and she hadn't heard from him since. The bench decided that if he did not appear at the time specified, a warrant would be issued. Isabella remained in Tasmania and lived with her son John and his wife Dinah in Wynyard in 1915, 2 years after the tragedy, and John was listed as a pound keeper. Kate's brother Alexander was the second eldest child. He was known as Sandy. By 1913 he moved from Tasmania and lived in Narrandera, New South Wales. From 1934 he was a station hand at Merriwindabone in northern New South Wales and at Collymongul at Pokataroo near Moree in 1937. Alexander died in 1945 and his death notice was in the Launceston Examiner. On the 11th of October, at the residence of Mr. Albert Cooney, Westbury, Alexander Coull, dearly beloved son of the late J. Coull of Carrick, aged 99 years. And it seems the family interchanged Coull, C-O-U-L-L, with Coull, C-O-W-E-L. There are quite a few formal and informal mentions of family members with that surname alternating. Kate, known as Catherine, was born on the 13th of September 1866 at Port Sorell in Tasmania. Kate had a daughter, Selina Maud Mary Gregory, on the 20th of August 1889 at Longford in Tasmania. It states on Selina's birth certificate that Kate was married to Philip Gregory, a farmer, but I cannot find a marriage record to substantiate this. And Selina is named Selina Maud May Coull on her death certificate. She died as an infant. Kate married Thomas Fox in Berrigan, New South Wales when she was 32 and Thomas 36. In 1903, Kate was living in Narrandera, and by 1910 they were living in Berrigan when they had a daughter, Isabella. Isabella was alive and living with Kate when the tragedy occurred, but I cannot find any further information on her. Isabella was only 3 when both her mother and father died. On the 24th of April 1914, in the Berrigan Advocate, there was the probate jurisdiction of the estate of Kate Fox, late of Berrigan, widow, deceased, interstate. An application was made for Isabella Fox, the daughter and sole next of kin of the deceased, to receive the proceeds of her estate. And Thomas Fox died in January 1913, aged 51, so only 5 months before his wife. In the Berrigan Advocate on the 10th of January 1913, there was no obituary for Thomas Fox. Residents of the town and district were much astonished on Tuesday morning last when word was circulated that Mr. Thomas Fox had breathed his last. Very few, if any, had any idea that he was ill, and consequently the news of his demise came as a great shock.
From what we can learn, the deceased was first troubled on Saturday and on Sunday was taken to his home and a doctor called in. On Monday afternoon, he again was medically examined and a swelling on the right side was discovered. However, no serious results were anticipated and Dr. Kennedy of Cobram was sent for to consult with Dr. Hilda the following morning. Mr. Fox took a bad turn during the night and in attempting to get out of bed had a fall. Mr. Hilda was again summoned, but the patient succumbed shortly after his arrival, death being due to a burst cyst. The deceased was a native of Kyneton and was 51. Some 20 years ago, in company with his brother Charles, he came to Berrigan and purchased his present holding of Momalong. The brothers worked in it as a partnership until a few years ago, when Charles Fox bought the adjoining property. In conjunction with the farm, Thomas Fox owned a shaft-cutting plant and traction engine with which visited farms in the district. Within the last year or two, he purchased a fairly large area of the Momalong subdivisional land, and it was on this property that he engaged harvesting when he was taken ill. He was an honest, straightforward citizen of whom the district had every reason to feel proud. Much sympathy is expressed with the bereaved wife and child, and also the relatives in their sad affliction. The funeral took place Wednesday afternoon, and the esteem in which the deceased was held was evident by the fact that there were over 40 vehicles in the cortege. Hilda Coull, a niece of Kate's, also lived with Kate at Berrigan when she was 6 years old. She was born in July 1899 to Margaret Jane Coull, the youngest in the family, at Wynyard, Tasmania, when Margaret was 24. Margaret did not marry or have any more children and stayed in Tasmania. Francis, known as Frank, was born on the 8th of February 1873 at Longford, Tasmania. He married Cordelia Amy Spencer in Narrandera on the 30th of May 1907. They had 4 children, 3 in Narrandera from September 1907 to October 1912, and their 4th child was born on the 13th of August 1915 at Parramatta. Cordelia died at Newtown in June 1919 of influenza. Their firstborn, Eleanor Kathleen, was only 12 when her mother died, and she stayed in Narrandera. Their second-born, Cordelia, must have been taken in or adopted by a family named Hopwood in Narrandera, as this is the name that she formerly used as an adult. Another of their daughters, Jessie Elsie, who was born in 1912, was placed into state care when she was 7 after her mother's death, as Frank at this time was in the Parramatta Mental Asylum. She was fostered by her uncle, Charles Haskew, in Narrandera. On the 23rd of December 1930 in Sutherland, New South Wales, there was an article in the Sydney Sun. For nearly 24 hours on the 23rd of November, the body of Jessie Elsie Coull, aged 18, floated in the surf off Gull Beach National Park, while onlookers, through lack of equipment, were unable to bring it ashore. Eventually, the body disappeared. This was stated in evidence at the City Coroner's Court today with the verdict of accidental death. The youngest child, Ellen Frances, was placed into state care on the 1st of February 1916, which was before his mother's death. It stated that Cordelia was living at Homebush, New South Wales, in care of Mrs. Hale, and Frank was in the asylum. Alan was fostered out to 6 families around Sydney. On his marriage certificate, he only listed his mother and stated he was born in Wagga. Alan served in New Guinea in World War II and stated he was born at Parramatta on this enlistment document in 1943, and there was another enlistment document in 1941 where he stated he'd been born in Wagga. He was discharged in December 1945. On the 7th of November 1913 in the Jerilderie Herald and Urana Advertiser. Brutal murder at Berrigan. Early on Sunday morning, a terrible tragedy was enacted at Osborne Farm, 3 miles from Berrigan, where Mrs. Fox, the widow of the late Thomas Fox, was savagely attacked by her brother, Francis Coull, while asleep. The weapons used were a tomahawk and a butcher's knife, and the unfortunate woman was left in such a fearful condition that death occurred at 8 a.m. on Sunday. The man, Coull, has been arrested. Facts are necessarily somewhat varied, but the following account may be accepted as fairly correct. On Friday afternoon, Coull had an interview with Mrs. Fox, and after a somewhat stormy conversation came on to Berrigan, where he remained until after 11 that night. Leaving town soon after that time on a bicycle, it is said that he actually rode past Osborne Farm a mile or two and double-backed on his tracks, made a noiseless entrance to the house and forthwith made the assault. While the victim was screaming, a young girl, Hilda Coull, a niece of Mrs. Fox, who was sleeping in an adjoining room, awoke and endeavoured to leave the house. but on being discerned by Coull, received severe injuries about the head. On 3 different occasions she was detained, but ultimately eluded the man and, catching Mrs. Fox's baby, 3 years old, made her escape to Mr. Charles Fox's house. About the same time, a brother named Alexander Coull, who was rather deaf, came in and, catching the butcher's knife, Francis Coull overpowered him and endeavoured to cut his throat. Although severely lacerated, Alexander Coull is not dangerously injured. While making his attacks, Coull used a strong acetylene bicycle lamp, and while partially using it to turn the glow on their faces, but also used it as a weapon. He was not content with this method of savagery, for before leaving Mrs. Fox, he upset kerosene on the bedclothes, set fire to the room, shut the door, and left Mrs. Fox unconscious. Alexander Coull then made for help, in all probability in ignorance of the awful fate of his sister. Francis Coull, having satisfied his insane passion, mounted his bicycle and rode to where he was working at Woodstock Farm. The police received the alarm at about 3 a.m. and shortly after were on the scene of the tragedy. The smoke was very dense in the room where Sergeant Simpson searched for the body, and it's a wonder that the victim had not been suffocated. He could only grope his way about and tripped over the body. The victim was fearfully disfigured and had 2 deep cuts on the face and 2 more on the back of the head, and in addition to minor injuries, she was severely burnt, all of her night attire having been burnt from the body. Everything that medical science could afford was forthcoming, but the poor woman only regained consciousness to inquire after her child and relapsed, never to wake again. Coull, who was working on a haystack, was arrested and confessed to the commissioner of the crime. Up till Monday morning, he presented a passive and almost uninterested demeanour, but broke from then. He had viewed and identified the body. The inquest was held on Wednesday. Prior to Coull making his way home on the night of the murder, it is said that he was on the lookout for 2 well-known young men whom he said he would chastise or kill, but evidently not taken seriously. Alexander Coull is cut and injured severely, but is not in a critical condition. Hilda Coull is far from being out of danger, hemorrhage of the brain being anticipated. Mrs. Fox was buried on Monday with a large concourse following the remains to their last resting place in the Church of England portion of the cemetery. And on the 7th of November 1913 in the Berrigan Advocate, on Monday morning the accused man, Frank Coull, was brought before the JP at the local police court on a charge of having feloniously and maliciously murdering Kate Fox. After giving evidence, Senior Sergeant Simpson applied for a remand to the coroner's court and the remand was granted. The accused man is of fair complexion with a heavy moustache and stands at 5'9". He is well known throughout the district, having resided here at different times for a number of years, where he principally worked as a farmhand. Although of eccentric temperament, he was regarded as a harmless individual. From all accounts, he was in Berrigan until late Friday evening when he attended one of the billiard saloons, and in playing the game appeared in a usual happy spirit, and his demeanour gave no indication that he had anything serious on his mind. And in the same edition of the Berrigan Advocate, a shocking tragedy: 3 persons attacked, 1 victim succumbs, a brother charged with willful murder. One of the most dastardly crimes in the annals of the Southern Riverina was perpetrated at a farmhouse, Osborne Park, the residence of Mrs. Kate Fox, at Momalonga Road, 3 miles from Berrigan, at 2 o'clock on Saturday. The victims were Mrs. Kate Fox, Alexander Coull and Hilda Coull, a sister, brother and niece respectively, as subsequent events proved of the accused man. From the facts available, it is evident that he entered Fox's bedroom and attacked her in a most brutal manner with a pocket knife and a tomahawk, inflicting wounds of a terrible character about the head and face. When Mrs. Fox first became aware of his presence will never be known. The other occupants of the room were Hilda Coull and Mrs. Fox's 3-year-old daughter Isabella. The intruder had a bicycle lamp alight with which he located his victims, and part of it was afterwards found in the passage. Somehow the contents of the bedroom became ignited, and it was not until then that the girl Hilda realised the dreadful happenings and heard her aunt's screams. On Friday night she retired in a room on the opposite side of the passage and had no recollection of how she got into Mrs. Fox's room. She made several unsuccessful attempts to escape, but was pushed back towards the fire by the man, who remained at the closed door. Ultimately, Hilda decided to keep quiet for a few moments in the hope that the intruder would go away. Fortunately, her hopes were realised, At the time, her uncle, Alexander Coull, who was very hard of hearing, had not known of what had previously been enacted, reached the middle passage door from an adjoining room which he occupied and was evidently also attacked. A struggle must have ensued as a trail of blood led through the kitchen into the backyard, where the two men fought, blood being spattered on the walls of the house and ground. As the men were thus engaged, Hilda succeeded in making her escape out the front door with the child Isabella and ran across the paddock to Mr. C. Fox's residence, and then she went the distance of half a mile to obtain the assistance of a neighbouring farmer, Mr. Dyer, who immediately proceeded to Berrigan and informed the police. Alexander Coull somehow evaded his assailant and also walked across to Mr. Dyer's house. On the arrival of Senior Sergeant Simpson and Constable McRae at the scene of the tragedy, the surroundings bore an air of stillness. The fire was still slight, but its progress had been considerably hampered by the fact that the house is a pine building and the bedroom door and window were closed. No response was received to the police inquiry if anyone was in the room. When the door was opened, the flames fanned up and the dense smoke repeatedly prevented an entrance. However, in a stooping position, the sergeant gallantly entered the suffocating room and first felt the charred bed, but it was vacated. A further search revealed that Mrs. Fox was unconscious and moaning in a nude state behind the door, her night attire being burnt off. He rescued the woman from her perilous position, and the task of extinguishing the flames was soon accomplished by the aid of water. The interior of the bedroom presented some of great disorder and bore unmistakable evidence that the woman had been in a desperate struggle with the intruder. The washstand was strewn about in pieces and a kerosene lamp shared the same fate. What remained of the bedclothes was saturated with blood. The window curtains had been consumed and wearing apparel in a tin trunk partially suffered destruction, whilst the fire had burnt a large hole in the centre of the floor. The police found a blood-stained pocket knife near the house, and the handle of a tomahawk, which also bore bloodstains, was picked up in the home, while the head of it was in Hilda's room. Alexander and Hilda Coull were conveyed back to their residence. Dr. T. Roberts was summoned, and he alleviated the sufferings of the victims. Mrs. Fox lay in a precarious position with extensive burns all over her body and marks of blows and stabs on the head and face inflicted by both sharp and blunt instruments. Alexander Coull sustained superficial cuts above the head and neck, while Hilda Coull's face was bruised and swollen. Sergeant Simpson returned to Berrigan later in the evening and notified the district superintendent of the crime, and then commenced a search for the suspect. Early in the afternoon, the sergeant, in company with Constable McRae, arrested a man named Frank Coull at a farm near Woodstock, between 8 and 9 miles from Berrigan, where he'd been engaged in harvest operations on Saturday morning, and lodged him in the local lockup. The action of the girl, Hilda Coull, 18 years of age, who'd resided with Mrs. Fox for the past 9 years, is worthy of the highest commendation for the determined efforts she made to escape, and undoubtedly her presence of mind saved Isabella Fox from injury. In relating the tragedy, Hilda said that she retired last night in a different room to Mrs. Fox. She saw a man who had an acetylene bicycle lamp alight. She made a couple of attempts to leave the room, but the intruder pushed her back. The police report received locally stated that the suspected man was Frank Coull, brother of Mrs. Fox and Mr. Alexander Coull, and that the tragedy followed an altercation between the brothers in a Berrigan billiard room. Frank Coull was formerly known in the Narrandera district, where he was commonly known as Deaf Frank, and had been employed as a farm and station hand. And that report was on the Saturday, and by the Monday it added a section to the article saying that Mrs. Fox had succumbed to her injuries without regaining consciousness, and the other victims are still in a weak state. On the 14th of November 1913 in the Berrigan Advocate, it had an article on the inquest. The inquest concerning the death of Kate Fox, widow, 46 years of age, was resumed on Friday. The deceased met her death under tragic circumstances at her residence, Osborne Park, 3 miles from Berrigan. Henry Simpson, Senior Sergeant of Police residing at Berrigan, deposed that he knew Kate Fox and rescued her from a burning room on Saturday. Since giving my previous evidence, I proceeded to Osborne Park and took a rough sketch of the building. I also found a wooden mallet, which appeared to have several spots of blood on it. On the 6th, in company with Constables McRae and Gibbons, I entered the lockup, and after cautioning Frank Coull in the usual way, I showed him the mallet and asked him if he used it on any of the victims. He replied, "No, I've not seen it before." I then asked him what time he went to Mrs. Fox's house, and he replied at 12:30. Was Mrs. Fox in bed? He replied, yes. I saw the light put out, but I waited a while before I went in. I asked him if he had a light, and his reply being yes, a bike light. I then asked him what he did when he went into the room, and he replied, I hit her while in bed. She then got out of bed and I hit her the second time and she fell down by the side of the bed, knocking the lamp over. As she fell, Hilda came in and I hit her with a hammer, but she got past me into Mrs. Fox's room and I hit her again and she fell on the floor. I saw the little child in bed and also on the floor. Then Sandy came and I picked up a bottle which was standing near the door and I hit him with it. When Sandy came, I threw the hammer away and went into Hilda's room. Sandy and I fought through the passage to the back door. I saw nobody going out the front door. All I had then was a knife. I came back and picked up the bicycle lamp and threw it on the floor. I then went out and put on my boots. It was very dark and I went away. 2 years ago I got sunstroke and I was very bad that night and my head felt funny. Henry McRae, police constable stationed at Berrigan, said that he interviewed Alexander and Hilda Coull. The former said, Frank cut my throat and hit me on the head with a bottle, whilst the latter said, Uncle Frank knocked me down twice and tried to smother me. Dyer handed me the tomahawk handle and bicycle lamp. Later in the morning, in company with the sergeant, I proceeded to Woodstock in search of the suspect, Frank Coull. When we arrived at the camp, Coull was sitting in front of the fire. I spoke to him, but he did not answer, and then I added, Come here, Frank, I want to see you. He then came out and I asked him what scratched his face and he replied, I was in a bit of a squabble at Fox's. We then arrested him for the attempted murder of Kate Fox, Hilda Coull and Alexander Coull. On searching him we found a razor in his trouser pocket, a watch and string guard, the latter being blood-stained. He asked us about his things and in the tent we found blankets, a handbag, a bicycle and a blood-stained shirt. The sergeant, pointing to the shirt, said, Is this yours? And he replied, yes. There was also a blood-stained coat and a pair of trousers on the fence in front of the tent. On being asked if he owned them, he said yes. We took him to Osborne Park. Alexander said, That's Frank, he tried to cut my throat. When I took him to Hilda Coull and asked her if she knew him, she replied, Yes, Uncle Frank, but take him away. Dr. T. Roberts, medical practitioner of Berrigan, said that he held a post-mortem examination of the body and that I am of the opinion that the cause of death was shock, caused by hemorrhage, contusion, depressed fragments of the skull, laceration of the brain and extensive bruises. The burns themselves were not sufficient to cause death. The burns were second degree on the back, extending from the shoulders to the waist, covering the whole of the back. There were small burns on the face and on the buttock and the left thigh and leg, and right arm, forearm and hand, as well as the left arm and wrist. There were extensive bruises on both eyes and on the scalp, also small bruises on the chest. About 1 inch above the left eye, there was a cut extending upwards and outwards of 3.5 inches. There was another cut above the left ear and a scalp wound on the vortex, being 2 inches and 3 inches in length respectively. The skull was fractured. In my opinion, the wounds on the head could have been caused by the tomahawk and the handle produced. Harold Dyer, farmer residing at Berrigan, deposed that at 2 a.m. on the Saturday, Mrs. Dyer woke me up and said she heard people screaming. I listened for a while and I thought I heard someone coming near. I got up and met Hilda Coull. She asked me to go over to Mrs. Fox's as Uncle Frank was trying to murder Auntie. I asked her where Sandy was and she replied he couldn't do anything. I asked her why she did not go to Charlie Fox's, in which she replied he couldn't go over and leave the other women. Mrs. Dyer changed Hilda's blood-stained nightgown and put her to bed. Her face was swollen and it appeared much knocked about. At this time, Alexander Coull came in a naked state with blood all over his face and chest. He asked me to go for the police. I said, what about Mrs. Fox? And he replied, no good, she's smothered. Mrs. Dyer and I came to Berrigan for the police. When we reached Osborne Park, we saw smoke coming out of the house and I assisted the police to remove Mrs. Fox and extinguish the fire and remove Hilda and Alexander Coull back to their residence. I saw the sergeant pick up the pocket knife and shirt, but I do not know the owner of them. I picked up the bicycle lamp at the door of Sandy's room. I gave the constable the tomahawk, which Mrs. Dyer picked up. I was present at my place when Constable McRae questioned Hilda, asking what had happened, and she replied, Uncle Frank hit me twice and knocked me down. Mrs. Dyer said that Hilda told her that Uncle Frank is throwing kerosene about. Hilda Coull, residing at Berrigan, deposed, I was at home on Friday the 31st of October and went to bed at 10 p.m. Sandy went to bed before me. Auntie and Isabella sleep in the front bedroom while I occupied the front sitting room and Sandy in the back room. The first I remember was that I was in Auntie's room and Frank Coull, my uncle, whom I recognised in court, was pushing me backwards towards the fire between the bed and window. My aunt, who was screaming, lay on the floor near the fire. Uncle Frank stood at the passage door leading into the bedroom. He was holding a bicycle lamp. He shut the door twice. He did not speak at all. I endeavoured to get out of the room and Uncle Frank pushed me down 2 or 3 times and put blankets over me. I did not see him light the fire nor strike my auntie. I smelt kerosene in the room. He was leaving the room when Sandy came and said, "What are you doing here?" but received no reply. I was on the floor then. I jumped up and I got Isabella and ran out the door, going over to Mr. Fox's house. I was screaming and Mrs. Jones opened the door and I went inside. I told them Uncle Frank was murdering Auntie. I asked Mr. Fox to go for assistance and he told me he could not because his wife and Mrs. Jones were afraid, but to go to Dyer's. Mrs. Dyer put a clean nightdress on me and I went to bed. I have no recollection of being struck. I had been under the care of Dr. Roberts since that night. Robert Bray, labourer residing at Berrigan, deposed that he was working at Woodstock and occupied a tent with a mate he knew as Frank, and he recognised the man in custody. They were working on the 31st of October and Coull left the camp during the afternoon for Berrigan. The witness was awakened at 3:50 a.m. on the Saturday morning by his mate entering the tent. I said, "You're home late, Frank," but received no reply. When the witness arose in the morning, he noticed Coull's clothes had mud on them and also that he'd had a couple of cuts on his face but asked no questions. Coull seemed quiet that morning and previously was of a lively disposition. He accompanied the other men to work. On the Friday before leaving for Berrigan, Coull wore a tweed coat, a pair of dungaree trousers and a light felt hat. Coull owned a bicycle, but the witness had never seen a lamp attached to it, nor in his mate's possession. He'd never seen Coull with a knife and identified the string watch guard as his property. John Duggan, labourer residing at Berrigan, said that he saw Coull on the Saturday morning, and when Coull said he was shaky, he looked so. He further remarked that he'd had a fight with his brother Sandy, but did not mention when it occurred, and no one asked any questions. Coull stated that he struck Mrs. Fox and knocked her down twice, but he did not say what with. After dinner, he said the police were after him through the row that he'd had at Fox's, and he was sure they would come as Sandy and Mrs. Fox were terribly knocked about. The witness replied, "They will hardly arrest you for that, but would likely summons you." Coull made the remark several times and did so voluntarily. The witness had never seen him with a pocket knife or a bicycle lamp, but he'd only known him for a few days. Alexander Coull, labourer residing at Berrigan, deposed that he was at Osborne Park on Saturday and was awoken by Hilda calling out. I got up and went out to see what they were doing, and I met my brother Frank in the passage. He threw a bottle at me and it missed. I hit him with my closed fist and knocked him down. He then struck me on the forehead with the bottle. He caught hold of both my hands and put my thumb in his mouth and bit it. I then went outside and Frank followed me. We again fought and he knocked me down and caught hold of my throat. On getting up, he knocked me down the second time and put his hand in his pocket, producing a knife and opening it. Blood was on my face and I could not see. During the scrimmage, the knife fell to the ground and Frank failed to find it. He went to the gate and I followed him. When I attempted to coo-ee, he struck me across the mouth with a piece of paling. Frank then went away. The coroner returned the following verdict, that I find Frank Coull, labourer, did unlawfully and feloniously violently assault and beat and otherwise injure Kate Fox, and from the effects of the beating and ill usage, as aforesaid, the said Kate Fox at Osborne Farm, Berrigan, did die, and I further say that the said Frank Coull at Osborne Farm, Berrigan, feloniously and wilfully killed and murdered Kate Fox. He was committed to stand his trial at the Criminal Court at Darlinghurst, Sydney on the 24th of November. And on the 21st of November 1913, in the Jerilderie Herald and Urana Advertiser. Subsequent of the inquest on the death of Mrs. Thomas Fox, the man, Francis Coull, was committed to stand his trial for wilful murder at the Supreme Court in Sydney. A contingent of witnesses leave shortly to be present. The other 2 injured persons are quite well again. At the last council meeting, it was moved that the action of Hilda Coull, by her supreme heroism in rescuing Isabella Fox, while herself in a very injured condition, be brought under the immediate notice of the Royal Humane Society. On the 5th of December 1913, in the Berrigan Advocate. So far, no mention's been made of the trial of Frank Coull, accused of murdering Mrs. Kate Fox of Berrigan. The local police received word to notify witnesses that their presence would not be required, and it's supposed that Coull will be committed to an institution. What course has yet been adopted has not been divulged. And on the 19th of February 1919, in the New South Wales Police Gazette in Berrigan, the Solicitor General has declined to proceed further against Francis Coull, or Coull, under committal, charged with the willful murder of his sister Kate Fox at Osborne Park near Berrigan on the 1st of November 1913. Coull has been confined in the Corrimal Mental Hospital at Parramatta since the 4th of December 1913, and he has not yet recovered his mental health, and it's proposed to transfer him to the mental hospital at that place. However, he was released as he is in the census in 1925, living at Greenmount in Queensland in the Darling Downs. He's working at Erkbarkers at Hodgson Vale as a labourer. Frank Coull gave evidence in a case, and it stated that he had been working at W. Elliott's farm in Hodgson's Vale in the February. On the 28th of November 1929 in the Brisbane Courier at Toowoomba, Frank Coull, aged 56, of Withcott, a wool getter employed by Mr. Pullen, was felling timber at Withcott this afternoon when, as the result of an accident with an axe, the first toe of his right foot was almost severed. In 1931, he was working as a labourer at Halidon in the Darling Downs, and Frank died on the 5th of May 1933 in Toowoomba, Queensland, aged 60. In the Brisbane Daily Standard on the 5th of May 1933. Man's tragic death, knocked down by doctor's car. A resident of Withcott, below the range, Frank Coull, aged 56, was knocked down by a privately owned motor car at the intersection of Lindsay and Harry Streets late last night and was so seriously injured he passed away in the General Hospital at an early hour today. His injuries included a compound fracture of the skull. The driver of the car was Dr. Mervyn Hall of Toowoomba. When about 50 yards from the intersection of Lindsay Street, according to the police report, Dr. Hall saw the form of a man suddenly appear before his headlamps on the driving side just a few feet away. Almost immediately he felt the impact of the man being hit from behind by the headlight and saw him falling backwards onto the bitumen. The car was travelling at 18 miles an hour at the time of the accident. Dr. Hall immediately pulled up and went to the assistance of the injured man. The police report mentions that there were no marks of car skids as if the brakes were applied. The only damage to the car was bent headlamps. The deceased was engaged in woodcutting. A friend of his has informed the police the deceased was very deaf and has suggested that because of this infirmity he did not hear the car approaching. The deceased sustained wounds on the back of the head and a compound fracture of the skull with cerebral lacerations. So far as was known, he had no relatives in Queensland, but was believed to have a daughter residing in New South Wales. The police reported that Dr. Hall was not to blame for the accident. So in the end, Frank Coull died of wounds very similar to the wounds that he inflicted on his sister 20 years prior. As for Catherine's daughter Isabella, I have been unable to find any further record for marriage or death of Isabella, and I'm assuming that she has been fostered out to another family and assumed a different surname throughout her life.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.